Hello, my name is Anne Simpson from CalPERS. I'm just delighted to be joining you for this IGCC summit. This work could not be more important. I'm also delighted to be on a panel moderated by Andrew Gray, who's an important colleague in the global work on climate change that we do together. We both sit on the steering committee for Climate Action 100+. And I have to say congratulations to Emma Hurd, the Chief Executive of IGCC. She's not only our wonderful host for today, but all the wonderful work she's doing on the steering committee with us both, and also shepherding our first progress report, which just came out. I also have to say the fact that I'm joining you through the wonders of modern technology does mean there is a zero carbon footprint to me participating in this panel. The alternative was to be flying around the world, or I suppose, if CalPERS had the budget, renting a zero carbon yacht to be sailing towards you. But this video link does mean that I have a chance to share some of our experience with you and also really show our support for the wonderful work that IGCC is doing. So let's go back to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017. That was a landmark policy agreement by world governments to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. What I think the summit meant for investors, for the financial markets, was that finally we had a global policy ambition that we could start to work within. And CalPERS did a carbon footprint of its 11,000 public companies in response to PRI's challenge, known as the Montreal Pledge. And we found something quite extraordinary, which is that for those 11,000 companies, less than 100 were responsible for the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions. So that made us realize there was the potential to develop a, if you like, a global focus list. So, hosted by the generosity of François Delattre at the French mission to the UN, we had a series of breakfast meetings. And French breakfast is always delightful. But more important was the conversation. We had our fellow investors from around the world and the investor networks like IGCC sitting to really look at this data that CalPERS had pulled together to say, well, if this is true for CalPERS, maybe this is going to look something similar for other big investors too, because we're all investing in the same global indices. So out of this, we decided to do something bold, which was identify the companies that were most important using Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And that was a very challenging data project. However, what it meant was that we had 100 companies that we identified through that methodology, and then we asked investors, which other companies are important to you? Perhaps in the transition they'll be important, perhaps they'll be important regionally. And that's where PLUS comes from. So we have the Climate Action 100+. And based on our own best estimates and guesstimates, based on CDP data, this group of companies is responsible for about 85% of the emissions in our portfolios. So making progress here really could make a huge difference on the Paris Agreement target of well below, which we're now interpreting to mean net zero by 2050. So how are we doing? Well, in the progress report that's just out, which Emma and her team shepherded to completion recently, we found that we're making really good progress in a whole range of different sectors. You can see we have almost a dozen companies now committed to net zero by 2050, which is a huge achievement. But we've also got a lot of work ahead of us. And in the United States, some of the challenges that we face are first that the policy agenda of Paris is contested. This isn't an agreement where there is unanimity, there is difference of opinion. So first of all, we can't hang our hat on a shared goal on policy. There's an important network which CalPERS is in called We're Still In, such that if the US does leave the Paris Accord, after the 4-year period, once it was announced by the president that would happen. If that happens, we have a network of investors, states, cities, businesses which are still committed to those goals. Because for CalPERS, this is not a political issue, it's an issue of finance and science. And that's really where economics comes together. Our fiduciary duty is to base our decisions on evidence. The next thing I want to flag is that we do have US companies making those net zero commitments, but we are still building share owner engagement in the United States. It's quite recent in the US for shareholders to even have the right to vote against directors. There's also a complicated process whereby when we file a share owner proposal, a company can say, no, thank you, we really don't want that on the ballot, and they can go to the regulator, the SEC, and say, please don't give us a rap over the knuckles if we decide not to include it. And you'll have seen that happened this proxy season with Exxon, where a number of Climate Action 100 plus shareholders filed a proposal. However, the company went to the SEC and asked for, if you like, permission to not include it on the ballot. So I would say because of the corporate governance regime in the United States, we face challenges. However, we're making progress. The leadership that we've seen, for example, in oil and gas in Europe, where companies like Shell, Total, Repsol, BP are working closely with their share owners and making commitments to make real progress, we see that really being very helpful in dealing with the challenges in the oil and gas sector in the United States. So this is really showing that this is a global project because we have global portfolios, but also the sectors that we're investing in are global as well. And we have the global commons of our climate, which we need to protect. And if we don't do that, we simply won't have the ability to invest over the long term sustainably so that we can pay the pensions to our members. So that's why this work really is part of our fiduciary duty. So thank you for letting me join you. I look forward to hearing about all the wonderful discussions from the summit and also to continue working closely with our Australian, Asian, European and global partners in Climate Action 100+. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne. Anne really was instrumental in getting the Climate Action 100 up and running and was inaugural chair, so she's certainly contributed a lot to the initiative so far. This panel, although it's discussing Climate Action 100 to a degree, it's more than that. It's really about, we want to sort of tease out company engagement on climate change. So what is best practice? What are the models that we're using? How are companies reacting? How can investors do it better? So it's very much trying to dig into those sort of issues. I was actually thinking it's probably quite appropriate that this session has happened immediately after the tea break, because some of you may have heard some people unfairly refer to company engagement as tea and biscuits. So you've all had your tea and biscuits, and this is definitely not going to be a tea and biscuits session. So as Anne said, I'm Andrew and I head up the ESG and stewardship function at Australian Super. Also with me today we've got Lisa McDonald from First State Super, and she's the head of responsible investment at First State Super. We've got Emma Pringle, who's the head of sustainability at BT. Francis Van Ryck, who's the head of investor relations at Qantas. And James Hall, who's the general manager of corporate finance at AGL. And we quite deliberately picked this panel, first of all, a couple of sort of leading investors that are doing a lot in terms of engagement, but also specifically picked investor relations people because we wanted to drill, while most engagement obviously would typically be done with a company board ultimately, we really wanted to talk to investor relations people to get that flavour of what they're seeing in that conversation with investors. So I'll sort of shoot the first question at you, Lisa, and just set the scene as, why is it that you are wanting to engage with companies on climate change?
Great, thanks Andrew. I think Anne said a lot of great things at the start, and we've certainly heard over the last day and a half of how important engagement is, particularly around climate change. So back in 2015, we presented a climate change adaptation plan to our board in terms of how we were going to look at climate change as a risk and opportunity in our portfolio, acknowledging that it was one of the largest risks that we faced across the whole of the portfolio. Embedded in that was three kind of key pillars in terms of what we would do. One of the most important ones of those, and one that we felt was really strong, was our engagement activities. And Then when we unpicked, yes, we want to engage. Our engagement program internally was fairly sort of at its early stages. So then we had to look at, so how do we resource this? So engagement, as you said, Andrew, is not having a cup of tea with a company. It's really doing due diligence on a company, researching a company, understanding their strategy, reading lots of annual reports and sustainability reports. So, sort of looking at how we could engage was also another important point. So that meant building internal resources. We felt we had to do direct engagement as well as doing collaborative engagement. And I think the collaborative engagement has just been so effective in that we're after the same outcomes. We're asking the same questions. We're having the same discussions, because a lot of times we had heard from companies as well, no one is asking us about climate change. No one is asking these questions. So it's then very much, well, if our investment managers aren't asking this, we need to be asking this. So then even bringing in what our investment managers are doing as well has just been part of what we feel is really important to understand climate change and how we manage those risks and opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's good. And one of the things I'm thinking of as you're talking there, Lisa, I'm a big fan actually of the investor agenda, which has basically there's sort of 4 tools in the investor toolkit. It's the way we invest, it's whether we engage, it's advocating for policy, and it's measuring and reporting. And what I think I've found quite interesting over the last couple of years is really how the engagement piece in that toolkit has sort of come into its own as being a really valid tool that we're all using. So that's been great positioning, but then from a company perspective, what's your side of it? Like, do you think engagement for investors on this issue is useful?
Well, I might kick off on that, Andrew.
Yeah.
So I think absolutely it's been a wonderful thing for us at Qantas. Without engagement, we've been acting on climate change for over 10 years. We've been instrumental in building the aviation industry's largest offsetting program, with one customer offsetting their flight every minute, which is pretty incredible. So it's clear that Australians are very focused on this. We're also helping drive the global aviation industry to emission reduction targets, and have been instrumental in building CORSIA, which is the aviation industry's global response to climate change. I think the other thing is it's really good to hear what investors really are expecting us to do. So we've been doing this in a lot of cases without that sort of feedback around the expectations of our investors. So I think IGCC Climate Action 100 is really giving us clarity around what investors are expecting.
Mm-hmm. And James, from your perspective, obviously particularly with AGL being in potentially a policy-challenged area as well, how does that all come together with that plus what investors are asking from you?
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is engagement's not useful, it's absolutely essential. And certainly from our perspective, clearly investors need to manage risk. We're the largest carbon emitter in Australia, and we absolutely are committed to a very frank and transparent discussion with our investors on how they manage that risk in their exposure to AGL. As you rightly point out, it's a very complex policy environment. I'm not going to comment on that policy environment on this panel, but what I would say is that with that policy environment comes a very broad range of stakeholders. Even on the investor base, there's a very broad range of different perspectives, timeframes, etc. But across the board, more engagement is better, and what we're finding with that engagement is that it's becoming much more sophisticated and much more, and it's becoming a conversation. It's no longer something that occurs, once or twice a year when the AGM's coming. It's an ongoing conversation, and that makes it richer and more productive. And a credit to the Climate Action 100 Plus and IGCC and all the other groups that have been involved in driving that conversation.
It's a good point, though. But is more better? So one of the things that we commonly hear from companies is just the overflow of information requests and things that investors are wanting. So is more better, or is it about quality, and how do you manage all that?
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations, I guess, that I have is that we have a lot of people engaged in responding to various surveys or verifying data from, web scraping, and that's just diverting our experts from actually taking real action. I think one thing that would be really helpful for us is to have the investor groups be really clear about what are the surveys that really matter, what are the ones you really want us to participate in. And from Qantas's point of view, we've taken an approach that we're going to do open source disclosure. So anything you want to find out about what Qantas is doing in sustainability, it's all there on our website. You can download Excel files with all of our data. Now, if that's not what you want, then we need to hear from you about whether we're reporting the right sort of stuff. But I would really encourage us as a collective to get together on what are the meaningful surveys. I had a meeting today with a service provider offering to help us do well on the surveys because there are so many. We're creating an industry now of people who are going to get paid to help us, work through the plethora and the network of surveys. So I think some clarity around that would be really helpful. Yeah.
We'll move off the data and get more to the face-to-face in a minute. But Emma, I just wanted to ask you, in a conversation that we'd had, you'd relayed your experience about companies coming to you and asking you what you think is useful. So do you want to sort of comment on that discussion and the role that you think you can play in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was absolutely in the context of Climate Action 100+, and one of the companies that we are leading engagement on. In our very first meeting, they said to us, this is great, exactly to your point. We are really keen to understand what it is that you want to see. We spend all this time preparing information and data and producing sustainability reports. What do you want to see in that? And I think it really struck home to me then that, we talk about engagement being a really key pillar of our approach to managing climate risk for BT and for our members, and that engagement is only effective when it's mutually beneficial and it's a two-way process. And this was, I guess, the first time that I'd seen that really in action. So we'd gone to this particular company with, our list of asks, and they'd said, great, we can absolutely share that information with you, but we also want you to share information with us. So it was, it worked really well.
Yeah. So just moving on from the sort of data, so now more in the context of sort of face-to-face meetings with companies. So I'm interested to get people talking about whether you think investors are clear enough in the ask of companies. So reflecting particularly on, say, Climate Action 100, one of the objectives there is emissions reductions in line with Paris. So what does that mean? And do we have enough information about that to actually create some action in this engagement work that we're doing? So I might start with the companies on this one. Do you think when investors come to you and engage, they're clear enough?
I was going to say, can I just give the mic back to you, Frank? Yes, I do. And I think, again, look, it's great to see the collaboration in the investment industry that enables one investor to lead an engagement with a company as works through Climate Action 100+, I think is a really great thing. It makes it more efficient. It allows those investors to become experts, as Lisa said, to do the research on the particular companies. And so you're having a very deep discussion. In our case, what are investors looking for? What they are looking for is to see that AGL understands the risks that it is exposed to by nature of its operations, and that it is managing those risks appropriately. Now, that may sound like a bland statement, but they're not. Our investors are not coming to us and asking us to solve climate change or to solve the policy agenda, etc. They recognise the complexity of that issue and that we are just one player in that. So, we don't find in any way that the conversation is one of unreasonable demands. Certainly there are then groups, and I know there are the likes of ACCR and Market Forces, I think, would be represented in this room, who take a more activist approach, and that's part of the conversation too. So I think that we find that all discussions are quite transparent and engagement is generally quite clear. So I don't think there's a lack of clarity there.
No. And Lisa, what about from an investor perspective? Do you think you're clear enough, and generally speaking, and how can we get clearer?
I think Climate Action 100 has given us a framework to be clearer. I would say probably, 4 or 5 years ago, we may not have been as clear in our asks. So to have that framework and to have those objectives and what we're trying to achieve, to be able to measure those, report on those, which I think is really important as well. We can engage with a company for years but never report or measure on what we've actually been trying to achieve and has there been an outcome. So I think having that component is is certainly really important. What we found, so we're the lead investors for 3 companies under Climate Action 100, so there's a lot of work involved in that. What we found is that collaborative and having everyone in the room and engaging and having the discussions, one, saves time for, I think, investors, also saves time for companies. The companies so we've hosted 3 roundtables with each of the companies that we have. We've brought in the experts that are actually doing the work and the scenario analysis, that are doing the policy advocacy within those organisations, because we want to deep dive. We want to understand how companies are actually doing things to get a sense of, are they managing their risk? Are they taking this seriously? How does that go up to the board level? What is the oversight then at the board when we can go and engage with the board? So I think it is definitely improving, and I sit back and I think, if this has worked so well on climate, where else can we adopt this sort of framework when we think about other issues that are just as important that we're engaging on as well?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things in this space is inherently it's a moving target. So even when I look at the relatively short life so far of Climate Action 100, but when it started close to 2 years ago, it was emissions reductions in line with Paris. But then inherently what happens in this space is we're starting to see the evolution of nearer term signposts. So net zero 2050 has basically become the target that we're all striving for. Some of the companies that I've been involved with, I think all companies probably, are finding that challenging. The goalposts continue to move. So as a company, how do you respond to investors coming back to you with an updated ask that's probably harder than what they had said before? And then how do you progress that within your organisations to get movement on that?
Yeah, well, I think, at Qantas we're all for ambitious targets, so I think that would be my first ask. We've had BA obviously come out and said net zero 2050. That's more ambitious than the global aviation industry targets. But one of the things for the aviation industry, I guess we can do things around buying new aircraft, updated technology on engines. We can do stuff around fuel efficiency, behavioural changes with our staff. But I think really on the policy front, a really big part of the aviation industry, apart from offsets, will be sustainable aviation fuels. And that's really probably our biggest challenge at the moment, is that the policy framework doesn't support getting a viable sustainable aviation fuel industry going in Australia or really anywhere else. I think there's a group of people in this room who could work with corporates like us to help, bring a sustainable aviation fuel industry to bear in Australia. I think it will absolutely be essential for aviation to reach that goal.
Yeah. So then back to the investors. So when you're engaging, what are the sort of qualities that make a good company engagement response?
So as I said before, there is definitely when it is a two-way conversation. So, for us, a good company response is probably also predicated by a good company engagement. And I'll let, I guess, the corporates on stage talk more around what makes a good company engagement from an investor perspective. But one of the things that we did at BT right at the start of our engagement was went to our investor relations department and said, when companies are engaging with you, what does good look like? How do you want to be engaged with? What are the pieces of information that is going to be relevant and important? And I think going into our first conversations armed with that information made it, particularly for me, it was my first foray into direct engagement, and it was really, really useful for us to go in and say, this is what we want to get to, but we also want to understand that you've got a whole heap of other stakeholders, you've got other targets, you've got other things that you need to consider, so let's talk about those. And one of the companies in particular that we engaged with, at the beginning, I think the conversations were not very constructive. It was very much, there was a bit of defensiveness, I think, perhaps on both sides. And we spent a lot of time talking to them, and, having real engaging conversations offline as well as in group forums where we had our investment managers as well as the other, support investors on Climate Action 100. And really trying to get to that point of understanding. And there were quite a few light bulb moments for me where the company said, you need to understand our environment, you need to understand that I can't disclose what you want me to disclose because it's commercially sensitive, because we don't know yet and we're still trying to grapple with that, because of all these other reasons. And it was, for me, a real, got it, I get that, you're not going to be able to give me that. What can we work on that's going to achieve our mutual goals? So I think really that openness, that transparency, that that real coming together to try to solve it together rather than an us and them approach. Because at the end of the day, we are doing this purely to understand how we can better manage our investment risk and how that company can be better managed for our members, not because we've got some other agenda that is at odds with that company's success.
Yeah.
Thanks. Excuse me, I might just echo that. So in terms of, we've worked quite closely with AGL. I think a success for us in the lead up to the AGM was there was obviously some shareholder proposals. We had been engaging in terms of under Climate Action 100 and had sort of, been very constructive in what we were asking, understanding the company's position and what they could say or couldn't say. And together developed a letter that was sent to Climate Action 100 and investors that AGL put together and clearly set out what they were doing so that everyone was informed in terms of the actions that they were taking, so that then people could make their own decisions based on that information in terms of how they wanted to vote at the actual AGM. So to us that was a great outcome. To get disclosure and to get information out to people who may not have actually been involved in those discussions that we were having.
Great. So we're going to get back to shareholder resolutions in a minute because that's going to be a good topic. But before we do, just from a company perspective, what do you see makes good quality engagement from an investor perspective? And also picking up on Emma's point there, do you think that investors, when they're engaging, appreciate the practicalities of what you're facing as a business enough?
Yeah, look, I guess I would say Climate Action 100 Plus is a really great framework, and I'd echo what Lisa said. From the corporate's point of view, it's really clear about what you're going to assess us against, and we can respond. The benchmarking against our peers is also really helpful for us. So I would say getting really clear frameworks. The one-size-fits-all survey doesn't really address the different risks. AGL has considerably different risks to us. So I think the direct engagement with the corporate around the risks that they face on any particular topic, climate action is what we're talking about here today. And so I think if we can be clear with each other and transparent with each other, and we have a round table as well coming up tomorrow with a number of the Climate Action 100 and AXI investors. So we'll be able to talk specifically about what Qantas is doing and what investors are hoping to see from Qantas.
James, you?
Yeah, I think good engagement is it's a recognition that the situations we're dealing with are dynamic. They're often quite ambiguous, and they require collaboration and transparency. I think Fran's alluded a couple of times, I completely agree. There are a lot of different surveys and data dumps out there, some of which are great, and some of which less so. But I think a recognition that whether or not you are above or below a certain number on a particular factor is not necessarily going to define whether you're managing a particular risk well. No problem. Some investors have those mandates and that's their cut-off and that's fine. But recognising that the engagement is so important, and we just like our investors to pick the phone up to us if they've got questions, and seek to understand not just the data but also the context behind the data. And we find most of our big, certainly the big institutional investors that we deal with are increasingly doing that, and we welcome that. The only other comment I'd make is we've got more than 100,000 shareholders. And amongst those 100,000 shareholders, probably more than 100,000 different opinions on some of these topics. So and you can't engage with every single investor, and so that is always a challenge. But certainly the large institutions that are strongly represented on our register and investing Australian superannuation money. They're increasingly proactive, and I think that's what.
But that alignment's a really interesting question. So, amongst your large shareholders, do you think they typically are aligned on issues of climate change, or do you see differences that you need to reconcile somehow?
No, I think that the bell curve is pretty. Most of the big institutions we deal with are clustered around the middle. You don't, of course, on the. There's myriad different types of investment firms out there with different views, seeking different opportunities. But the large ones who are long term on our register tend to have a pretty mainstream and central view on this topic, which is that it's a risk that needs to be managed.
And then, as companies, do you learn anything from engagement? Is it a two-way street? And to what, how important is using shareholders as a sounding board for what's happening out there in terms of what your shareholders are wanting?
Well, I think it's extremely valuable to hear what the owners of the company are thinking and what they're seeking. I would encourage more open engagement. As James said, pick up the phone. Because we want to engage with you around the things that we're doing or the things that you are seeking for us to do. So I think it's fantastic. It's absolutely essential, and it helps us all as a system, sort of do better.
Yeah. So we'll just move on to shareholder resolutions, which a few of us have been living with over the last few weeks. A couple of high-profile ones around, obviously, as most years these days. So both Qantas and AGL have both had shareholder resolutions. Admittedly, Qantas obviously not climate-related yet. But what would you say in terms of... I wasn't implying anything necessarily. From a company's perspective, are shareholder resolutions useful?
Look, I'd say, it's part of democracy, and it was shareholder democracy, and it was interesting to hear what Anne said. I'm not really that familiar with the other jurisdictions, but clearly there are protections for corporates in other jurisdictions. I think it depends on the resolution.
Yep. James, what's your view?
The resolutions that we have had have been on, serious matters. That it's completely, we view it as legitimate for our investors, large or small, to be asking questions about. Do we welcome resolutions? No, we don't welcome resolutions because, we'd rather deal with these things without a resolution needing to be brought. But we haven't had an experience of them being used spuriously, and I don't think many companies have. I think it's part, as Fran says, it's part of our, it's part of the way that the capital markets work. It's something companies need to be able to respond to. Yes, there are ways in which the mechanisms or sort of thresholds for those resolutions could be tweaked, but that's kind of a detail. That's not necessarily.
So, do you think that what's being brought forward is representative of the broader shareholder views?
Well, we had two resolutions at our recent AGM. One of them was on this very topic of how we were responding to the Paris Agreement and the way in which we were disclosing our risk analysis on that topic. And that is what we spend more time discussing with investors than any other topic.
But when we get to the specifics, so I think that one at your place was related basically about sort of shutting down coal-fired electricity generation by 2030. So do you think that's representative of what investors are wanting?
No, I don't think that particular... what I would say is I think that most of our investors recognise that AGL is not in a position unilaterally to make that kind of commitment, regardless of what different stakeholders may believe is appropriate. And for that reason, we had very constructive engagement with most of our investors on that topic, and the resolution didn't get up.
What was the vote? Was it 30?
It's still got 30% support.
That vote, yeah. So is that of concern to you? On one hand, you say, well, it's not representative of what investors want, but there's 30% of investors wanting.
I think it represents that the topic is something that investors are obviously quite focused on, and rightly so, because it is the question of carbon risk management is obviously a major issue for an investor in AGL, so it's quite appropriate that investors should be focused on that topic. The detail of the resolution is something that we obviously recommended shareholders vote against because we didn't think that particular time frame was supportable for AGL to be acting unilaterally, and indeed the greater risk that AGL would bring upon itself from behaving in that way is something that would not be in shareholders' interests.
Yeah. So that raises a really good point, the difference between what resolutions are asking for in principle versus the detail of what's in the resolution. So a question to the investors, how important is it that you agree with the actual wording as opposed to the principle?
Yeah, Thanks, Andrew. So look, I'd like to comment on a couple of things. I think, shareholder proposals have a place. Our approach has certainly been that we would prefer to engage. I think as the market sort of evolves and we get a lot more sophisticated around engagement, if we're not getting the asks and the responses and we have concerns that companies aren't managing their risk in a way that is appropriate, I think we'll see investors more and more putting up shareholder proposals, and that wording and the ask is really important in terms of what we're actually asking. So you would think it would be aligned to what you've been engaging on. You're not getting those outcomes, so therefore I'm going to put a resolution up to the company to show how important this issue actually is, and I don't think you're managing it appropriately. The mechanism in Australia in terms of putting shareholder proposals up is problematic as well. Maybe there's an advocacy piece around that. I know ACSI's sort of done some research into that. So bringing into this debate around how important is engagement, how important is advocacy in changing markets or in changing reporting, changing a lot of things is also really important. So there's lots to unpack with shareholder proposals. Our approach is to look at each on their merit, how we've been engaging, the responses that we have, and then we'll vote accordingly on that.
So you use an interesting phrase there, the expectation that more investors will put resolutions up. So you larger mainstream big funds putting more resolutions up?
There's a lot. Vision Super, I don't know if they're here, have supported one at BHP. I think if our engagement is not working, then it is something that we need to think about in terms of using that tool in our toolkit.
Yeah. And Emma, what are your thoughts on specifics versus principle, and would you consider putting resolutions up?
So on the specifics versus principle part, obviously the specifics matter. In fact, a shareholder resolution was raised against one of the companies that we are engaging with, and it fell over on a technicality. And if I reflect on that particular resolution, we didn't raise it. It was raised by another group at a time that we were deep in conversations with a particular company, and it was, I think from the company viewed shareholder activism and shareholder engagement, us and the people that had raised and were supporting the resolution, all in the same bunch as people who are making a problem for me, and it was quite distracting from the conversations that we were trying to have. So I think there is a bit of a distinction between the shareholder advocacy piece and the shareholder engagement piece that we're working through, and activism, which I think has a slightly different nuance around it, in that one is focused on climate change and stopping climate change at any cost, and the other is on managing the investment risk that is associated with climate change as an investment manager or as an asset owner. And it's something that latter that we are focused on, and whilst the principles are largely the same, the technicalities are different, so I do think it matters. Would we raise one or support one? I think it is really important to recognise that Climate Action 100 Plus is a 5-year engagement, and certainly when we went to the companies that we are engaging with, we were very clear that it is a 5-year engagement, and there are certain goals and things that we want to see progress on, and that we have milestones along the way, and that certainly if those milestones aren't being met, then we do need to consider what else is in our toolkit. I think at this stage it is probably too early for us to consider raising or supporting a resolution with the companies that we are engaging on for the purposes of driving the Climate Action 100 agenda further, but in the future, who knows?
Yeah. So we're running short of time. We want to leave some time for questions, but just a couple of other issues. Just going back to the companies, so do you think the existence of shareholder resolutions on climate, or in your case on other issues, has that created a greater sense of urgency within your companies? And do you think your companies have done more on those issues than otherwise may have been done in the absence of the threat of shareholder resolutions?
Yeah, well, I think if I stick with climate change, because that's what we're here to talk about today. So, as I said, Qantas has been working on this topic for over a decade, and we've done that without shareholder resolutions. And we've done it largely without a lot of engagement from investors on that anyway. So it's a matter that we thought was important, to the managing risk for our company. We're 99 years old in about a month, and you don't get to be that in the aviation industry without being very focused on managing the long-term risks in your company, and we certainly hope to be here, for another 100 years. So, I don't think in our case, and perhaps that's why we haven't had a climate change resolution is, we're very proactive about managing the risks that are coming at our company. We have been doing that for 99 years and will continue to do that.
James?
Yeah, and the answer is no. The resolutions have not changed. Nothing that we're doing is a result of resolutions. The resolutions are a result of the broader environment to which we're responding, and we're doing all those things anyway.
Yep. I guess we're getting close to the end, so I think if I think this through, one of the things that makes engagement and not tea and biscuits is the fact that ultimately it does, or we as shareholders have the power to vote. Obviously shareholder resolutions we've just been discussing, but in particular we vote for directors and we vote for remuneration reports. So I'm interested in people's views as to what extent do they think climate change considerations will start to inform the mainstream vote, so the director vote or the REM vote. Remembering, of course, that some companies are moving to put climate change metrics into their REM plans.
Thanks, Emma. Look, I think we will see a lot more of that. I think if if the ask is of companies around whether it be emissions reduction, where they're putting CapEx into projects, aligning strategy, aligning exec REM, at some point that will become what we are actually voting on in terms of REM structures. When that happens, I don't know, and that's something we're going to have a view on, and certainly vote how we think as well. With that will come disclosure. REM structures and REM reports are lovely as they are challenging to read at the moment as well and get through and understand the intricacies of it. But, when we're looking at REM and voting, it's around what's a company's strategy? Is their REM aligned to long-term strategy? We are long-term investors. We want long-term outcomes for our members and we want companies to be sustainable. So whether it's, climate change or other issues will probably, that will be the future. So we'll just have to look at that on its merit. We've certainly, on some companies, looked at directors and their re-election where there may be a sustainability committee in place, and we've seen incidences where there's been failings around safety or responses to climate change, and do we vote against the chair of those committees when they're up for re-election? And that's all on a case-by-case basis. When you don't get annual elections, though, it's very hard to sort of vote individual or directors if there is something that year. But it really will just, I think, inevitably flow through into our decision-making.
I mean, fundamentally, climate change skills are something that we want to see boards have. Yeah. So, Emma, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I very much agree. I don't have much more to add, other than really noting it is, I guess, the materiality of the knowledge and the importance to the particular company and issue at the time, and with climate change becoming ever more material, then absolutely it would start to permeate through the other voting decisions that we make. Yeah.
And just before we go to questions, just then from the company perspective, so what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that is where shareholders are likely to go? And also, what is the discussion like at companies now in terms of what are the climate change skills on the board and how do we communicate that to shareholders?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if we're here to talk about engagement, and hopefully the engagement through the year is effective, so that we're having a robust and genuine conversation about your expectations of what the climate can do, and as James said, there are kind of limitations to what we can disclose. There are limitations to how fast we can act. So if we have a fruitful engagement, I would expect that you wouldn't need to use a director election or a REM vote or a shareholder resolution.
Yeah. But would you say it's a reasonable thing for investors to expect climate change skills on the board, and that would become part of our director assessment?
Look, I think there's a range of skills that need to be on boards, and climate change skills is increasingly one of them.
What are your thoughts on that, James?
How does one define climate change skills? I mean, ultimately, it comes down to risk management, and absolutely, that is what any investor would expect a competent director to be focused on, amongst other things.
Yep. All right, now we are running very short of time, but it's probably a good opportunity for questions. So if there are questions out in the audience, now is the time. Got one here? Yep.
Thanks, Andrew. Alexis Chang with Mercer. I really commend the work of Climate Action 100+, but I guess my question is really for Lisa and Emma, in that these are the largest companies in Australia that are the Australian companies on Climate Action 100+, and many of them, like AGL and Qantas, already have really good programs and strategies around this. So are your organizations engaging with the smaller market cap companies who may have a significant focus on climate risk? Because I hear from mid-cap companies, investors in ESG, what are you talking about? No investors ever asked me about that. So, and Andrew, your own view on that would be interesting too.
So I think under Climate Action 100+, it is a very defined list of companies who are the most significant emitters globally. And with that, there is a number in Australia, the few that were identified in 100, and then the plus list that we, as a group, agreed on would be those that were the biggest emitters, or those that were most significant for other reasons, or where we could most influence. So I'd probably slightly challenge that all of the large corporates that we're engaging with have good plans and progress in place. A lot of them do, and obviously, you know, those who are here today do. But certainly there's a lot of work that still needs to be done at that level, and I think that is where, if we can make some progress there, then hopefully that will kind of lead and change a lot of lead the market to some degree. Does that mean that we shouldn't be, or that we're not engaging at across the market? No. In terms of direct engagement or collaborative engagement under this structure, BT certainly isn't doing it in that method. We don't have the resources to have this level of depth of conversation directly or collaboratively with the range of companies, so we rely on others, on our engagement partners to do that for us, and I think they do that very well on our behalf. But, you know, if you think about Climate Action 100, it is a very specific program with a very specific outcome. I think it's right that we are focusing on that group. Did you want to?
So the way we've approached it at First State Super is our overall engagement plan. We have a framework in terms of identifying companies that we want to engage with, and into that comes our ability to influence. How much do we own? So looking at value at risk, looking at environmental, social and governance risks. So it's across the whole spectrum in terms of our engagement plan. We could probably nearly engage on the ASX 300 on any ESG issue. So looking at materiality as well is really important. With limited resources, it's hard to engage everybody on everything. So whilst we do Climate Action 100 with 3 companies, that's a lot of work involved in meeting that framework, but we do engage with other companies around material risks, whether they be environmental, social or governance. In terms of, it's also looking at your exposure and how much we might have in terms of mid-cap companies in our portfolio. I think what's really important then is for us to challenge our fund managers that might have a mid-cap mandate, and what are they actually asking companies if they're not asking how they're managing climate change risk, because we can't, you know, do it all on a limited resource. They're picking the companies, they're investing in those companies. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do to ensure that our managers are asking the questions.
Now I think we've got one at the back here.
Yeah. Elaine Pryor, now a consultant. Just a question about what the programme feels is the ambition for companies, fossil fuel companies whose only assets effectively are oil, gas or coal in the ground, in the context of net zero by 2050. And I know there was a bunch of European companies named earlier, oil and gas companies, but effectively they have a variety of businesses, and from what I've seen of what they're saying, a lot of it refers to other parts of their businesses apart from what they suck out of the ground, but things to do with refining and distribution and so on, and what they sell for us to fuel our vehicles with. So just wondering how far one can get with companies that don't have any other assets effectively, and also when we ask companies about scenario analysis and so on, whether we necessarily believe what seems to be a fairly consistent industry response to that analysis.
I'm going to let Andrew answer that one as the chair of the Climate Action Australia Advisory Committee.
Well, I mean, the short answer to that really is that the value of your fossil fuels is going to be very low or zero in a net zero 2050 world. And so that's the question for companies. What does your business look like post 2050? And if you need to transition away from fossil fuels, then as investors, that's what we want you to do. So I think that's the sort of...
Yeah, and I think, Elaine, we have to take each company on a company-by-company basis and as part of the program make our own decisions, you know, in terms of where we want to invest our money and whether we want to continue to invest in different industries. But, you know, point taken.
Okay. Adam.
Hi, Adam Kirkman. Just a quick one on aviation in particular. Fran, I think he's kind of right as one of those sectors where potentially a sectoral-based approach makes a lot of sense, countered by Liz's point about the idea of looking at individual companies on a case-by-case basis. But there are clearly opportunities, I think, around engagement where sectoral-based approaches and sectoral-based initiatives are worthwhile. I guess it's to what extent down the track could that be an opportunity to leverage the work of Climate Action 100 into sort of broader and deeper and beyond the scope of the 100 plus at the moment?
So Andrew, I mean, you can chime in to say if there are other airlines in Climate Action 100. I think there are. So one of the things I think when Andrew and I started engaging on Climate Action 100, I said, well, do you know about the global industry approach to tackling climate change? So we have CORSIA, which has set targets for the aviation industry to 2020, 2030 to 2050. Then not net zero, but as I said earlier, we have some policy challenges and we need to get some technical solutions that will help us get there. So I think it's not really that widely known that the aviation industry is tackling this as a group. One of the reasons was there is a patchwork of different legislation around the world. We've been subject to New Zealand ETS, Australian domestic ETS, EU ETS, and the aviation industry came together and said, look, we've got to sort this out. We need to do something. And in 2021, we'll start having to have carbon offsets for any growth that we will have in emissions. So I think for us as the aviation industry, there's more, I guess, we can do to say what we're doing as a global industry to address this challenge. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
One thing I'd just add to that, which is sort of maybe not directly answering your question, but I think one of the interesting things is Climate Action is obviously very focused on transition risk. And I think one of the interesting things is should we be doing more on physical impact risk as part of Climate Action 100, getting that more in the conversation. Now, I'm very sorry, but we're getting the wind-up call, so we might have to end it there. But I'd just like to say a sincere thanks to the panellists for their candour and their very fulsome and great responses. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed that session. So thanks very much. Thanks, mate. Good on you.